Bill, nice to chat again. Happy holidays, always a pleasure. Let's do this here in a different way. Number one, wasn't a huge prospect coming out of Fresno. Not that big, had to bounce around in the Marines. He got lots of size, got bigger and stronger, went to Alaska, found his way, ended up at USC. He wasn't that dominating phenom out of high school that I think a lot of people associate these great pitchers with. Talk about that first. Go ahead.
Yeah, he wasn't. He was a very good pitcher. He was probably the best pitcher on his little league team and also his high school team, but he was small. He was only 5'9", 160 when he graduated from Fresno High School, and he worried about that a lot. He was kind of the runt of the family. He had a whole family of athletes. His two sisters were athletes. His brother was well over 6 feet tall and was an ex-Marine and a swimmer at the University of California. And, of course, his father was a great golfer, amateur golfer in the 30s. But Seaver was kind of, as I said before, he was the runt of the family, and he worried about whether he was ever going to grow. And to the point where at one point in his senior year, he was talking about this with one of his teammates on the baseball team, and they called over a guy on the basketball team. And he said he had this guy come over to their table. They were at a pizza place, and he said, "Put your hands against his hands." And this guy was about 6'4", and Seaver's hands dwarfed him. And his friend said to him, "You see, Tom, you've always had the biggest hands on the team. You will grow. We don't know when, but you will grow." But anyway, he told his parents if he couldn't get a scholarship to college, he was not going to go to college on their dime. He was either going to go on his own athletic ability, or he was not going to have to figure out something else to do. And what happened was he didn't get any scholarships when he graduated from high school, and he decided to go into the Marine Reserves. And he went into the Marine Reserves. He was 5'9", 160, and 6 months later, he came back from 99 Palms, California, and he was 6'1", 210. That's what I call miracle grow.
100%, and there he goes. His career blossoms from there. And from a brevity perspective, we need to get into the Hodges relationship. Gil Hodges came from Washington in a trade, managed the Mets. Boy, it's almost like a father figure to Tom there, Bill. Obviously didn't stand for losing, didn't want to, accept any moral victories. Right up Tom's alley. Let's talk about that relationship for a sec. Go ahead.
Yeah, they were. Hodges was the most important person in his life, and Seaver even told me he was the most important person in his life, other than his father. It was a father figure type relationship with Hodges. He just absolutely adored Hodges, is probably the best word to give you on that. And of course, they had a lot in common. Hodges was an ex-Marine himself, and Seaver was obviously had such admiration for Hodges, and Hodges was a taskmaster. Seaver hadn't been used to that. His previous manager with the Mets, Wes Westrom, was a nice guy, but he wasn't anyway like Hodges. And Hodges came in there, and he really let everybody know that it was going to be his way or the highway. And Seaver liked that. He liked discipline because, again, he was an ex-Marine. And he tells his story in the book about his first year with the Mets, and Hodges called him into his office one time, and he said, "Oh my God, what is this going to be about?" He had no idea what he wanted. And Hodges calls him in, and he says, I wanted to ask you something. When you were out there on the mound, do you ever think about your wife?" And Seaver says, "Well, yeah, I look in the stands, I make sure she's sitting where she's supposed to be sitting, and I think about her a lot." And Hodges said, "Okay, thanks." And he dismisses him. The next day, he calls him into the office again, and now Seaver's really worried. He says, "What does this guy want?" And he calls him into the office, and Hodges opens up his desk drawer, and he pulls out a picture of himself rounding first base and blowing a kiss to his wife in the box seats after hitting a home run. And Seaver said he looked at that picture, and he knew exactly what Hodges was talking about. And he said, "Every time I tell this story, I get goosebumps, because that's what kind of a guy Hodges was, and that's what kind of an impact he had on my life."
Wow, it's a good one. Now, and I'll tell you, too, you got a lot of good, juicy information in there with the Donald Grant scenario. You obviously speak to the son-in-law. You got a quote who worked for the Mets at the time. And you like Dick Young, too. He's a mentor of yours. And Young really, You know, he was the orchestrator behind that. He was very biting, and he basically, in a lot of ways, ran Seaver out of town in that trade in '77 to Cincinnati. It's very juicy. Give me some thoughts on that for a sec. Go ahead.
Well, obviously, Dick Young was a mentor of mine. I was not at the Daily News at the time. I joined the News in '78, and this was, of course, in June of '77 when all this was going on. And Grant solicited Young's support in this contract dispute he was having with Seaver, and everything was it was not Dick Young's finest hour. Let me put it that way. And I'm glad I wasn't at the News because I don't know what I would have done. But anyway, Young was taking up management side on this whole thing, and finally it came to a point where Seaver, when Grant was threatening to trade him, and Seaver finally went over Grant's head and worked out a new contract with Mrs. D. Rollet. She was the daughter of Joan Payson. And it looked like maybe this situation was finally resolved. And then, as I say in the book, Young wrote one more column, and the 33 words that effectively drove Tom Seaver out of town, and I'll read them to you. Quote, "Nolan Ryan is getting more now than Seaver, and that galls Tom because Nancy Seaver and Ruth Ryan are very friendly, and Tom Seaver has long treated Nolan Ryan like a little brother," unquote. The Mets were in Atlanta at the time. This is the day of the trading deadline. Seaver's sitting around the pool, and somebody showed him this Dick Young column. He gets up from the pool. He dashes across the way to his room, goes up to his room, gets on the phone to Joe McDonald, the general manager of the Mets up in New York, and says, "Get me the hell out of here. This is the last straw. I will not tolerate him bringing my family into this. This is too much. Get me out of here." And of course, that night was the night of the Midnight Massacre, and McDonald traded him to the Reds. And he also traded Dave Kingman, who was also in a contract dispute with Grant. And at the time, Kingman was the Mets' all-time leading home run hitter.
And he traded him to San Diego. All right. And then, of course, the aspect of this that's very interesting there, Bill, is I did not realize how sick Tom was at the end. I mean, Lyme disease, and we all know about the dementia, but he was really, this is going back 5-6 years. I don't think anybody really realized that. We knew he had the Lyme disease, but we got the retiring from public life. But you chronicled it. He was not well for not just a year or two, for a long, long time. Go through that for a sec. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, as I've told a lot of people, and this was a very deeply personal book for me because I was friends with Seaver. It was more than just a writer-player relationship. We became very good friends. And I was privy to his decline because I did so many interviews with him at the end. I was the guy that he basically broke the story to, that what was going on in his life was his Lyme disease had come back 30 years after he first contracted it in Greenwich, and it was little by little robbing him of his memory. So this last chapter, I kind of detail his decline, and it was a very hard chapter to write because, as I said before, I was right there for so much of this. And when I went out to interview him in 2016 for a documentary that I did on him, he was great, and Nancy was great, and we had some really great stuff with them for 2.5 days out there. We went back the following year in 2017, and I could not believe the decline of his mental state. He couldn't remember anything about his career. He couldn't remember anything about his 300th win. He couldn't remember anything, very little about the '69 Mets. I had to prod him on all of those things, and that was really painful for me to see what had happened to him.
Excellent job, Bill. You did a superb job. You know how much I love you anyway, but this book is, and you've done a lot of good ones. It's an excellent book. You keep up the good work. You have a happy holidays. And, of course, always a pleasure to talk to you. Appreciate it very much here today.
Okay. Thank you, Dog.